Good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to the final installment of our series of 4 webinars. So this session is titled Developing Allies and Advocating for Change. I'm Hima Vaidullah. I'm co-governor of the New York State chapter of the ACC, along here with Dr. Naidu. And as you recall, we had initially created this series of 4 webinars in collaboration with the Pennsylvania State chapter of the ACC. And we're so glad for everyone who has helped to create this and support us through this. So today I have with us Dr. Parekh and Dr. Childs. And Dr. Parekh and Dr. Childs have actually been in the DEI space for greater than 20 years giving presentations. They have written and co-edited the publication titled Stigma and Prejudice, Touchstones in Understanding Diversity. So Dr. Parekh joined MD Anderson as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer in May of this year. And previously, she served in a variety of DEI roles, including in the ACC as their inaugural Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. And she was also, as previously worked for the American Psychiatric Association, where she was also Deputy Medical Director and the Director of Minority Fellowship Program. Dr. Childs is the professor and chairman of surgery at Morehouse School of Medicine. He's a fellow of the American College of Surgeons, and he's board certified in both general surgery and critical care. And Dr. Childs currently sits on the American College of Cardiology Board of Trustees. So Dr. Parekh and Dr. Childs, we're so glad to have you here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to present today to the New York chapter. And thank you so much for all of the support you've provided us over the last few weeks in developing this talk. And also, you guys should be congratulated for this 4-part series that you're having on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we really appreciate having the opportunity to present today. And I'll get started. The topic today is developing allies and advocating for change. Next slide, please.
And Katerina, don't forget to share your screen. Yep, thank you.
Unfortunately, we have no conflict of interest. Good mentor mindset. If you don't have a conflict of interest, you're not in the game. So Dr. Parekh and I, we're not in the game yet. So no conflict of interest. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Dr. Childs. First of all, I want to say thank you as well to the New York and Pennsylvania chapters for their dedication to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Dr. Childs and I are just delighted to be part of your 4-part installment. I just want to give a shout out to Katerina Stromberg, Mary Patterson, the executive director, as well as the co-governors, Drs. Srihari Naidu and Hema Vidalu, for having both of us here today to talk about a topic that's so dear to both Dr. Childs and myself. Our agenda, we start off with an interactive exercise. We understand that there were 3 previous webinars, so this in some ways level sets to see how much we have learned around bias and microaggressions and prejudices, and more importantly, I think, realizing how difficult they are to actually spot them. From that, we're going to look at some definitions before diving into strategies. We'll start with initial strategies that are somewhat universal, and then talk about individual and interpersonal strategies that we can leverage in our everyday life. And then finally, we're hoping to engage in a robust conversation around how does one create an inclusive workplace. Next slide. And I'll hand it to you, Dr. Childs, to get us started in our interactive exercise.
All right, great. Next slide, please. So most of you guys may be familiar with the video. It went viral. And it's a video from Britain Got Talent. And it's a video of Susan Boyle, who had a performance several years back. And I want you all to participate in this exercise. And what we want to do is to basically look at the exercise and imagine that you're either the judge there judging this performance, and just kind of some introspective type of examination of the video and your thoughts. So next slide, please.
So if I can get everyone to close their eyes, we want to make this as confidential as possible. You too, Dr. Nadeau, I'd like to have your eyes closed. I can see them on you too, Dr. Childs. So if I can have the next slide, I want to go through this exercise and you'll understand why I'm asking everyone to close their eyes. Honestly, the first time you saw that performance, did you expect that voice from Susan Boyle? Raise your hand if you did. And again, this is confidential, so everyone's got their eyes closed, or if you're off the internet, if you want to use one of the reactions below with your hands up, that would be great. Okay, let's give that a few seconds. All right, why don't you put your hands down and open your eyes? Does anyone want to talk about why they expected that performance or why they did not expect that performance the very first time that they heard Susan Boyle sing? Do you want to share, Dr. Nadeau?
I mean, I think people have preconceived notions of what they've seen in the past. I mean, obviously singing is very different because it's not an external visualization type of skill set. But I think people have expectations. I think there's one person in the audience, a young lady who rolled her eyes, which is telling you that they think that how someone looks relates to what they can deliver. And I think that's why the one judge said it's a wake-up call for all of us to understand that we have those preset notions.
Great response. I love the point that you hit on was how somebody looks, that we judge somebody based on the way they look. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next exercise. So again, just one more time, please close your eyes and to maintain confidentiality when I ask you the next question. If we could have the next slide, please. Raise your hand with your eyes closed, everybody, or use the reactions below. If you have ever experienced someone prejudging you, raise your hands if that has ever occurred to you. And if your hand is not up, I want your life. All right. You can put your hands down. I see a lot of hands. Thank you for that. Does anybody feel comfortable sharing what it was like to be prejudged before? Anybody want to unmute and feel comfortable? If not, I'm going to call on you, Dr. Childs. I know you.
Dr. Parekh, I've watched this video hundreds of times, and we've given this talk many, many times. I still get emotional watching this video. And the reason I get emotional is because I've been a trauma surgeon, been in that situation many, many, many times throughout my career. And I just root for the underdog. I root for just unexpected excellence. So I really feel that video. I can't watch it enough.
And we have a comment in the chat that resonates with what you just said. There's a comment that said, I was hopeful she would knock it out of the park because I wanted her to prove all the judgmental people wrong, not necessarily because I had any idea how well she could sing. I don't think it's a huge jump to say this is an exercise that very much could find itself in medicine and healthcare, and how often we have people who prejudge whether or not we can be an interventional cardiologist or be on the board of trustees at ACC, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to come back to Susan Boyle. We're going to come back to some strategies that we can employ. But before I do that, I want to hand it back to my colleague, Dr. Childs, to talk about some definitions that we're going to be going over today.
Okay, next slide, please. Well, I just wanted to level set with some definition. Next slide, please. Now, we use these terms bias, implicit bias, microaggressions, upstander or bystander, ally, mentorship, and sponsorship. Next slide. And I just wanted to go over a few definitions for all of the terms that we're going to basically be using today. And I know this is the fourth in the series of talks, but I thought it was important to kind of level set. Well, first of all, a bias is a preference or aversion toward a person or category of person, as opposed to being neutral. And implicit bias suggests that there's some subconscious beliefs or unrecognized, unintentional, deeply ingrained stereotypes that result in unconscious reactions and or behaviors. And in the terms of unconscious bias, it often is used interchangeably with implicit bias. Microaggression, we define that, and I know you guys had to talk about microaggressions at the last session, if I'm not mistaken. But microaggression is everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to the target persons based solely on their marginalized group or membership. And we subdivide microaggression into micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidation. And I know that you all guys have been able to go over these terms. Next slide, please. So what's an upstander, and how does that compare to a bystander? An upstander is an individual who actively defends a cause or a belief or intervenes when someone is being bullied, mistreated, or targeted by a microaggressor or harasser, as compared to a bystander who is able to be there at the moment, but may not stand up for that individual. And getting to what this talk is mostly focused on is allyship, or what's an ally? How can you be an ally to the person or a situation that you may see? An ally is any person or any group who actively promotes and aspires to advance the culture of inclusion through intentional, positive, and conscious efforts to benefit people as a whole, as well as individuals. So allyship builds relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability. So next slide, please.
Thank you, Dr. Charles,
Parekh.
thank you for those definitions. And I just want to highlight that the definitions up to this point actually come from ACC's health policy statement on building respect, civility, and inclusion in the cardiovascular workplace. And as you may know, it was unveiled at the 2022 annual meeting in Washington, D.C. Earlier this year. The following two definitions come from Harvard Business Review and the NIH, and it looks at the distinction between mentorship and sponsorship. Many of you know that there have been articles around the importance of both. They're very distinct, and both are definitely needed along with coaching for success. Many women, people who are from underrepresented backgrounds in medicine, have talked about the paucity of both, and particularly sponsorship. So mentorship is a professional working alliance in which individuals work together over time to support the professional and personal growth, development, and success of the relational partners through the provision of career and psychosocial support. So there is a mentee and a mentor, and oftentimes this is driven more by the mentee. In the sponsorship definition, there's a sponsor who's somebody very senior and a protege, and most of this is driven by the sponsor. So sponsorship is a kind of helping relationship in which a senior, powerful person uses their personal clout to talk up, advocate, open the door for a more junior person. So while a mentor is someone who has knowledge and will share it with you, a sponsor is somebody who has power and will use it for you as well. Next slide, please. So we're moving away from these definitions, but we're going to be coming back to them and operationalizing them as we look at strategies. So in our next session, we're going to talk about strategy, but before we do that, I'd like to go back to Susan Boyle. And in the next slide, we have a question for you. Well, Dr. Childs had asked for each of you to pretend in our interactive exercise that you were in the audience or you were a judge. So if I can have the next slide, Mary. If, let's say, you were a judge and you're watching Britain's Got Talent when Susan Boyle came on stage, and Dr. Nay, you brought this up, somebody in the audience was rolling her eyes. There was definitely, I think, jeering in the audience, even co-judges were snickering and laughing. Would you have intervened when you heard other people microaggressing, heckling Susan Boyle? And if you could put your answers in the chat or just unmute, I'd like to get a sense of how many of you would have intervened in that moment. Give that a second to see if we get any responses. Otherwise, I think I'll pick on you, Dr. Hema, to see what would you have intervened?
I think yes, but it would depend on whether I was like a new judge on the show or a judge who'd been, on the show for a while. When you first join any type of team, you're initially trying to just better understand the culture, better understand the relationships between everyone. And you may be unsure about supporting someone. But I think if you are a more seasoned judge, if you've been there for a while, then you can feel more confident about saying, hey, guys, I don't completely agree with that.
Thank you. That's a very thoughtful response. And we're going to unpack that a little bit with the next slide, Mary, because it's a study that really supports what you just said and some of the concerns about standing up. So there's really two studies here. So let's look at the one on the far left, which is part of the wheel, if you will. And this comes from McKinsey and Company in 2019. And they interviewed women and men. So this is really around gender and looking at women in the workplace. And the magenta purplish color represents women and the teal blue color represents men. So you see in the first study, they asked employees if they witnessed biased behavior, so it was very broad, towards women. Did you witness it? So the first step in any kind of strategy, and we know this in medicine, before you can do anything, you have to see something or you have to acknowledge that there's a problem happening. And you see that only 1 in 3 women witnessed biased behaviors toward other women. And approximately 1 in 10 men said that they had witnessed biased behaviors toward women. So that's the first step. And again, kudos to the New York chapter and Pennsylvania chapter for having the series, because you cannot have enough of these to really help people begin to spot bias and to see it. Because even in the case of microaggressions that Dr. Charles just talked about, they're so subtle that it's easy to miss as the victim or the perpetrator. So of the 33% women and the 11% of men who actually witnessed biased behaviors, they were then asked by McKinsey and Company, would you have objected to the biased behaviors that you actually saw? Almost 50%, both men and women, said they would not have done anything. So not even as thoughtful as Emma's response. They just said no. A quarter of them said that somebody would do something, that they had been in settings where a quarter of the men or women would say something. And there's definitely overlap with that. And the final question is, how many of them actually did something? And about a third said that they would be the ones objecting or saying something. So you see the work we have ahead of us. We need to help people become aware of bias. And I would extrapolate this not just to women, but to any group where they are the other. And then giving them the confidence, but also the tools on how one intervenes. And again, I think this is why we're going to be now spending the rest of our time talking about strategies. I'll hand it back to my colleague, Dr. Childs.
Next slide, please. So I think one of the things that Dr. Nadeau wanted from us is to make sure we talked about strategy and how can we overcome these particular issues, and to talk specifically about changing the culture and becoming an ally. I think the initial step is awareness and also reflecting on the process. So next slide, please. Awareness includes, being aware if someone is microaggressing you or committing some type of motivated act towards you. You should be able to listen very closely and understand when these type of things happen. Next slide, please. And then you should reflect on the process, kind of a reality test. You have to be able to build some type of resilience to these type of insults, and take time to process and assess the situation so that you understand what's going on. So next slide, please.
So I think the first step outside of the reflection and processing piece is when there has been a biased action towards you, or you are hearing about somebody who has experienced something negative that seems personal or prejudicial or discriminatory, is to first ask, are you having a bad day? What is the context of the experience for you? And this has to be done very carefully, because the last thing you want to do is to invalidate somebody's experience. We know this, all of us are probably have worked with medical students, residents, people who are junior to us, ancillary healthcare. So you want to first and foremost, validate the experience that they're having. And then as you dig deeper to see if there's any context there. More times than not, and I have been a chief diversity officer in multiple settings now, and I'm always amazed by how often what somebody experienced actually did happen. It's much more ubiquitous. And again, the health policy statement led by Dr. Pam Douglas at the ACC shows that this is rampant in the House of Medicine. And it's more likely than not somebody is not paranoid and something did happen. So it's really important when you experience something or you've been approached by somebody who says something happened to really hear about it and get that constructive perspective, somebody who's not going to just egg you on, but really going to help you and aid you as you unpack what has happened to you psychologically. So another, I think, critical strategy in the next slide that goes under reflection and processing is building resiliency. So you see in the next slide on building resiliency, there's multiple ways. And this could be a whole talk in itself. And I know medicine has talk so much about how do we build resiliency. It's something we should be doing before we enter college, medical school, and continue to do throughout our careers. Having supportive networks is critical. Again, much harder for women and underrepresented groups in medicine. So it's critical and it's really important for you, especially if you're advising and supervising people of color and women, realizing that their networks can be much smaller than you. Education and training, and again, this is an example of why this is such a powerful webinar. It's bringing exposure to this topic for people who are potentially the victims of or targets of bias, but also for those who may unintentionally be perpetrators. Mentorship and sponsorship, critical. Sponsors are the ones that can really open doors for there to be objective action and strategies at the institutional level as well. Always really important to build strengths and to focus on yourself. It's not a bad idea if you are experiencing a lot of prejudice or bias to spend some time focusing on yourself and reflecting on yourself. We're going to get to allyship in a bit, but being a really good ally means helping people sometimes to reshift on themselves and to help them build their own strengths, because this is usually a long road and we know medicine is a long road. Next slide. The final point that I would make in this section about reflection and processing is really taking time to process what has happened. I don't know if they said this in the very beginning. I'm a psychiatrist by training and practice for almost 20 years. And this is probably one of the things within our wheelhouse is really helping people take the time to process the experience, taking notes for yourself. It doesn't have to go anywhere. It's just for you to, in any way, write down what you think happened, to build self-awareness, to improve your own understanding, and to prepare for the next steps, which could include that you're not going to do anything about it. Dr. Charles mentioned that he and I have given this talk in so many different places. We were just at a for-profit company recently, and it's interesting how much our own understanding really increases every time we give this talk. And it's another reason why we're going to have a lot of dialogue. It's really, really critical. So in the next couple of slides, I'm just going to start with some tactical strategies and then hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Charles, to take the next few steps. So let's say you are in a situation where somebody has hurt you and it's been something prejudicial, micro, macro. I think the first thing you need to do, and again, you've had 2 other stages before this. You've had the awareness, you know something happened, you've reflected, you've processed this, but you think you now want to enter in a dialogue with the other person who hurt you. You need to ask yourself a few questions before you engage. First, can you have a frank discussion with a person who has hurt you? Is it possible to have that conversation? If you are somebody who feels like you're new and you don't know yet, or you're not sure, you may want to hold off. You also have to ask yourself, is the person well-meaning? Do they have insight? Do they have the capacity to reflect? Not everybody has insight. You could be very, very bright, and IQ doesn't translate to EQ or even cultural quotient. And this also gets back to, did somebody intentionally or unintentionally hurt you? Usually if somebody's intentionally hurting you, they're not microaggressing you, they're probably micro-assaulting you, which is much more intentional. So you want to really assess that with a mentor, an ally, before you even engage further. And then you have to ask yourself the question, what are the consequences for you if you do have that conversation or if you don't? What will it cost you to have a conversation with somebody, to actually ask them if they understand what they did to you? As a psychiatrist, I will say, I've heard it all the time. People wish years later that they had a conversation with somebody, because that experience stays with them. And some studies show that if you can have a productive conversation, it no longer becomes an issue. But I will also caution you that having that conversation, if you're not ready or if you don't feel like the person is correct, you can continue to have hurtful comments coming your way. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit of a flow chart. If you decide to move forward, we know that it's much more helpful to not say things like, Dr. Childs, you microaggressed me. It's much more helpful for me to say to Dr. Childs, help me understand why you said what you did, or why you did what you did. And to use statements like, I felt like you were, making comments because I am a psychiatrist and I'm not a high-powered surgeon at Morehouse, which might be true. And then without blaming anyone, because again, this is an open conversation, you're trying to understand and build understanding. You're not blaming, but you're asking and you're explaining to the other person what the situation felt like for you. I say this over and over again, it seems very simple, but you are 100% right about your own feelings. You are probably 100% wrong if you try to ascribe feelings that somebody else had. After you do all this, be quiet and give the other person a chance to talk. And also to realize, if it gets quiet, that you have been preparing and maybe that person is not ready to have the conversation. And maybe after you're quiet, if it is really silent, give the person an opportunity to come back so that you can continue this conversation. I'm going to hand it off to you, Dr. Childs.
Next slide, please. Dr. Parekh, before I cover this slide, you have personal experience with the person that actually coined the term microaggression, Dr. Chester Pierce. And, I just thought about the conversation that we've had over the years about some of those conversations you've had with Dr. Pierce. Do you mind sharing the story that Dr. Pierce told you about the hurt that he experienced throughout his life, and one particular incident, that story you tell, please, if you don't mind?
Oh, sure. You're putting me on the spot, but it's such a powerful story. So I appreciate the opportunity. And maybe just as a little bit of a background, Dr. Pierce was a professor of psychiatry, social medicine, and education at Harvard, and coined the term, as Dr. Childs said, in 1969, but had thought about the term for many years. He had a lot of firsts in his life, first African-American intern at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and had seen quite a bit in his life. And post-civil rights was very interested in the ongoing subtle ways that people continued to be hurt if they were African-American, and subtle things that maybe other people couldn't spot, but that were very stunning and very demonstrable to African Americans as recipients and targets of microaggressions. The story that he told me in the 20 years that I knew him, and he was a training supervisor, and in the last 7.5 years, he and I helped build a Center for Diversity in the Department of Psychiatry at the Massachusetts General Hospital. He told me the story 3 times, and he told me the story almost verbatim every single time. Same tone, same pauses, which tells you almost sort of the trauma effects of a microaggression. And I've called this the airplane story. And it involves Dr. Pierce being on an airplane, sitting in the middle seat of a plane, and next to him on the left-hand side was an empty aisle seat. And across from that empty seat on the aisle, on the other side of the aisle, there was seated a white male. And Dr. Pierce had come onto the plane with books and notebooks. He had planned to go through books and writings and also keep his own notes with his journal. And it was clear that, like many other people boarding this plane, that they too had many things that they were hoping to accomplish during this flight. It became clear that this flight was going to be very full soon. And as one of the last passengers was coming down the aisle, she was a white woman. It was clear to Dr. Pierce that she was going to be sitting next to him on his left-hand side, the aisle seat next to him. So as she was veering toward that seat, Dr. Pierce pulled in his feet because he was sitting in the middle seat and wanted to make sure that she had ample room to easily sit into her aisle seat, and then even stood up to make it really easy for her. But at the same exact time that he did that, the white male sitting on the other side of the aisle seat stood up and gave his seat to the white woman. And then he proceeded to sit in the aisle seat next to Dr. Pierce. It was clear that when Dr. Pierce looked around that nobody had really taken much notice of that, and probably not even the white man sitting down. But for Dr. Pierce, the entire flight, he thought about that incident. He thought about whether or not it was done intentionally, because a throwback to his years, a white man wouldn't let a white woman sit next to a black man. And then he wondered if it was unintentional and he was just trying to give her more space and have her be more comfortable. And it went back and forth in his mind, wondering if it was intentional or unintentional. And again, that's one of the most insidious aspects of a microaggression, that takes up one's energy, space, and time and mobility from thinking about other things. And ultimately, we know that discrimination is meant to be a distraction to keep people from moving forward and mobilizing. But I think it's an important point to remember that if this happens once, and the idea of a microaggression is that it disproportionately happens more often than not every day in the lives of African Americans, and wherever somebody is underrepresented, that there will be a cost to their physical health and mental health. So you can imagine that this concept and some of the strategies we're going to talk about are really meant to heal people, because it can cause physical and mental health consequences to be discriminated against, whether it's unconscious or conscious. Dr. Childs?
Thank you, Dr. Parekh, for that story. I wanted to cover some strategies to deal with mistreatment. And there's a model called a SAFER model, and SAFER means stepping in, addressing the behavior, focus, explaining the institutional expectations of the institution, and reporting the incident. So let's start with stepping in. So an example of stepping in includes when you observe inappropriate behavior. One of the responses can be, help me understand your request. It sounds as if you're a clinician, this is a clinical example, you're asking me to have you receive treatment from another physician. The second component of the SAFER model is addressing that behavior. And one way to address that, a practical way, is to suggest that all of our clinicians and staff here are qualified to care for you. And this should not be an inappropriate type request. This should be appropriate for that individual that we all here trained to care for your individual illness. Focus on the institutional values, that the institution is committed to quality and excellence in patient care, and kind of reverse the conversation from the specifics of why you are asking me to provide you with another physician to talking about the institutional approach to quality and patient care. Explain the expectations. All the physicians, doctors, everyone here is committed to equal and fair and dedicated, committed treatments for all patients. And you should also report the incident and document the event, just in case there's issues down the line. Next slide, please.
Thank you for that, Dr. Charles. And you know, I really love the SAFER model. We're going to be sending a bibliography later, but just so you know, that comes from a Jack article in 2021 entitled "How Cardiovascular Disease Fellows Can Promote Diversity and Inclusion in Cardiology." And it's such a handy reference on how to ask open-ended questions, and really questions that engage people and really help people ultimately heal. So we'd like to now go to individual and interpersonal strategies. And in the next slide, we'll look at upstander responsibility and allyship. So let's start with upstander responsibility in the next slide. I know Dr. Childs gave some definitions earlier that came from ACC's health policy statement. He talked about what an upstander is and what a bystander is. I just want to, highlight as a psychiatrist that there's been enormous amount of work looking at why bystanders sometimes stay as bystanders. And while there is a lot of movement to help people, if they can be upstanders, it can be quite therapeutic for themselves, because we know that you can observe something that's traumatic or something that's hurtful. And even though you're not in the direct line of fire, it can certainly affect you. So being an upstander can be very helpful. We also know that sometimes people can't be upstanders, and being a bystander is already triggering. And so sometimes standing up can be very difficult. So I want to read these definitions as definitions and not put any kind of value judgment on these two. A bystander is somebody who witnesses an event or an incident that can be discriminatory. And an upstander is somebody who intercepts the incident and feels comfortable doing so. Next slide, please. Dr. Childs.
Let me give you an example of an upstander. During the 2012 presidential debates, when Barack Obama was debating Mitt Romney, a political commentator after that debate stated, "I highly approve of Romney's decision to be kind and gentle to the retard," referring to Barack Obama. As a rebuttal, a few days later, an article came out, and it was from John Franklin Stevens, Special Olympics athlete. And he said, "Being compared to people like me should be considered a badge of honor. No one overcomes more than we do and still loves life so much. I do process information more slowly. It has taken me all day to figure out how to respond to your use of the R word." So I thought that was a very good example of how one could be an upstander. Next slide, please. We're going to go back to the concept of an ally or allyship, and we're going to redefine that. An ally, as I said earlier, actively promotes a culture of inclusion. And an ally can be anyone that decides to make a positive difference, who the effort is to benefit people as a whole. So we're going to give several examples of an ally and how an ally can make a significant difference. Next slide. This is probably one of my favorite slides. This came out during the Black Lives Matter movement after the incident with George Floyd. You all guys probably all know about that. But I love the image in the middle of a young girl holding up the sign, "My Black Friends Matter." So that's so cute. But that's an example of multiple groups coming together to support a common cause to change the culture. So that's a very good example of allyship. Next slide, please. Dr.
So
Parekh?
thank you for those slides and those comments. So the goal is really to be an ally, but to be an actionable ally. And so what that really means that your words and your actions really need to be in sync. You can't just talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. And actually, words without actions can be detrimental and can work against the change. And we're certainly seeing more and more, particularly our Gen Z, who are now in the workforce, 87% of them expect there to be actionable DE&I change, diversity, equity, and inclusion change. So they're really pushing for there to be more of actionable change. So in order to be a true ally, one should really understand that you're lifting others up by advocating. You're sharing growth opportunities with others. You're not viewing, you're not venting a personal attack against them. And not thinking of them as, if they want to vent, don't think of that as a personal attack. We hear people all the time talking about how hard it is, particularly underrepresented groups, being in majority populations such as medicine, and to really give them the space to vent and please support them. That recognizing that systemic inequalities are real, and that there is impact, health and mental health consequences to microaggressions. We also know microaggressions can affect systems, and really validate the experiences of those people who are underrepresented in medicine. So essentially listen, support, reflect, change, validate, and act as an ally. Next slide, please. The next two slides come from an article from Harvard Business Review, which I thought was really critical to this particular presentation. I appreciate Dr. Childs for letting me sneak this in the last minute, since it was just published less than a month ago. And it's entitled "Stop Protecting the Good Guys." And it really looks at gender bias. As we all know, the rates of sexual harassment in medicine is significant. It actually outpaces the other STEM fields. That women, while they are majority in the healthcare workforce, they are not the majority in leadership. So the men on this call can certainly practice allyship in hearing this. You know, the research notes that men don't condone sexism. So they understand that, but that they're reluctant to confront. And this particular article, which I recommend you all read, it's a short read, it's a quick read. Some of it has to do with the fact that there is the whip penalty or the bro code that keeps them from speaking up. The problem with the good guy defense, which is really about how if we know somebody is inappropriate and making discriminatory comments toward a woman, many people will then go defend that person, saying, at the end of the day, he's a good guy. He supports his women. He's got doctors. He's got women in his family that he supports. He's got daughters in medicine. He's got women trainees. They condone the behavior by saying he's a good guy. So they dismiss it. But in the process of doing that, you're gaslighting women as the problem. And you're also enabling the offender, the male, keeping him from having an opportunity to overcome his blind spots and growing. So this is making a case as to why we need to speak up, that using the good guy defense, condoning the behaviors of men in your own mind or with other people is really not helping anyone. And it's probably most detrimental to women because it's gaslighting them, but it's also curbing the opportunity of men to grow. We could have said the same thing if you replace it looking at our LGBTQ plus community and any other marginalized group. It's really an opportunity for us to open up and speak. The next slide, which I really love, and it comes from the same study, says that it's really important to defend yourself against the good guy defense. And the first and foremost is what Dr. Child said a few slides ago. We have to have awareness. How do we identify sexist or discriminatory behaviors? And how do we build cultural intelligence, gender intelligence, DE&I intelligence? How do we check in with the person who we have observed has been the recipient or victim or target of behaviors? And an example would be, you go to somebody who may have been the target of something discriminatory and say something like, I heard your director dismiss you, or dismiss other women who had expertise at the meeting. I felt like it was gender microaggression or a gender discriminatory comment. Am I reading that right? So you validate that with a person that's experiencing something discriminatory. In doing so, you're also supporting that person. It's important to support and to understand, but not to dismiss and not to gaslight the target and the victim. So it may be even more firm than the example I just gave, but to say, I believe you. From what you described to me, that behavior does not seem appropriate. Can you tell me more? Again, inviting them to share, and in doing so, validating. What I love the most about the article is that it has helped people begin to reframe. And again, I'll say this for the third time, and hopefully last time. As a psychiatrist, so many times we take ideas and we reframe them to make them more palatable. I think another reason why people don't speak up, they're not actionable allies, they're not upstanders, is because they're afraid to confront people. But let's say we reframe the word confront to carefrontation. So from confrontation, we go to carefrontation. And what that means is that we care enough about the person, the good guy. We care enough about the organization, the team that we're working in. We care enough about the people in the cardiovascular space to say something. So if you change your framework, I can guarantee it will change the way you approach somebody so that you can really have a conversation and you can really help people change the way they behave. You know, Dr. Child's example of the Special Olympics, and which I thought was so beautiful, the example of an upstander with the Ann Coulter and Special Olympics athlete, Stephen Franklin. It's such an elegant and effective response. And I think that's what we want, is we want to get conversations. And if we frame it as carefrontation rather than confrontation, I think we're going in the right direction. Next slide, please. So allyship, like many things, in cultural competency being one of them, and cultural humility, it's a continual investment of time. You have to practice it. You have to keep reading it, and you have to keep supporting people and holding yourselves accountable when mistakes are made. Using the apology and being prepared to rework an approach if it's needed. True allies listen to people around them. They're adaptable. You know, a core element of diversity, equity, and inclusion work is cognitive flexibility, being adaptive and reworking a strategy that I may use for Dr. Childs may not be a strategy I use for somebody else. And being comfortable with being uncomfortable is another major tenet in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I think it's a unique and challenging journey to become an ally, but I certainly have been one many times in my life, and I've had people be allies for me. It's certainly, I think, a worthwhile journey. Dr. Childs, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, next slide, please. Now, we like to pause here before we go into the final stretch of our talk. I think we have a few more minutes left, but for all you guys who may not recognize this image, this is a picture that was taken of the LA Clippers. And the story at that time was the owner, who was Donald Sterling, had made some inappropriate comments at the time about professional athletes, especially the NBA. And as a unit of solidarity among the team, that first game following the comments, all of the players turned their shirts inside out to show support for the NBA players. So that's another example of allyship. Next slide, please. Dr. Parekh.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Another really great example of allyship. So let's talk a little bit now about creating the inclusive workplace. And Dr. Charles, I think we should stop talking so much and let's get this audience talking, because I know everyone's got great strategies.
Yes.
So if I could have the next slide. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about micro affirmations. Some people have called this an antidote to microaggressions. I will say that while microaggressions are very small and powerful and can hurt people and are infectious, we know that microaffirmations can be small, powerful, positive, but also equally infectious. And then we're going to talk about fostering inclusion through upstander responsibility, allyship, and creating organizational change. Next slide, please. So very briefly, a microaffirmation, it was a term coined by Mary Rowe, an economist who was at the MIT Sloan School of Business, and she called microaffirmation something small, subtle. It's a way of acknowledging a person's value and accomplishments. It's not meant to give any kind of sense of advantage over one person, but it can very much, affirm somebody in a positive way. Next slide, please. Examples of microaffirmations in today's world where people are always on their phones. I always tell people listening to them actively is a great example of a microaffirmation. Making eye contact with people, particularly people with varying abilities, I think is really important. And on-the-spot praise and appreciative inquiry, where you're asking people about their thoughts, getting them going and thinking, is a great example of microaffirming people. Next slide, please. Dr. Childs.
We're going to talk a little bit about an inclusive environment and being an upstander and an ally. Calling in bad behavior, inappropriate behavior, formerly called calling out, but it's calling in. People in privileged positions have the ability to call out unacceptable behaviors toward underrepresented people. Underrepresented people may not feel comfortable raising these type issues. Tasking all employees with getting involved with diversity, inclusion, in any related task. Embracing and fostering an environment of inclusion is good business. Next slide, please. Using inclusive type language, making sure you are cognizant of the language that we use. For example, instead of saying girlfriend and boyfriend, you may use partner to be more inclusive. Rolling out unconscious bias training on a regular basis. It's not a one-time fix-all type of training. It's a process and it occurs over time. Just being familiar, talking to your peers and understanding and growing to make a more inclusive type environment. Next slide, please. Try different methods to recruit. Started recruiting a diverse population to enrich your environment. Different tactics, inviting more people in for the process of interviews and looking and understanding some techniques to interview different candidates for different positions. Recognize when you're privileged and use that voice to help those that may not have that particular privilege in this society to provide a better environment. Next slide, please. Listen, you can learn from all different aspects of this culture and all different people from all different backgrounds. So make sure you have an open mind to listen to all of the voices so you can help understand what may be your bias and learn from different voices. Become a sponsor, become an ally. Like we talked about earlier, a sponsor is someone that is actively involved in aiding someone's career progression. So next slide, please. Dr.
Thank you. Sure, thank you, Dr. Childs. So let's talk about creating inclusive environments. And so this gets us now to the systemic level a little bit. And and the pieces that we can do to help that. It's so important to have top leadership commitment if you're going to create an inclusive environment. Ongoing training critical. We're trying to achieve cultural competency, but beyond that, we need to continue to have training, because what is appropriate today may not be appropriate, you know, in 2 months or 6 months or a year from now. We know that more and more people are at the intersection of multiple minority statuses. So we need to continue to educate ourselves. And I think ongoing education and training, because nobody really truly achieves cultural competency. And we certainly want to teach people to be culturally humble. It's so critical to model what we are talking about. You know, if you are in leadership roles, and if you are modeling good allyship, upstander behavior, inclusive behaviors, you're micro-affirming, people are going to catch on. Again, these things are very infectious. And the flip side, unfortunately, is also really true. We're hearing more and more businesses, and certainly for-profit. Dr. Charles and I were recently giving a talk at a Fortune 10 company, and they were talking about incentivizing inclusion, so that bonus pays were being tied in to their efforts around inclusion and their report cards, if you will, around inclusion. Appreciative inquiry is really about being curious. Cultural curiosity is really, really another aspect of being appreciative and being inquiring of what people are saying. So again, you know, an opportunity when you are in a situation and something feels discriminatory, or you're hearing something that somebody else has said is discriminatory, to really ask more questions and to be curious. Again, if you can and you're able to, or if you are a leader in an organization and you're hearing about these kinds of things that don't appear to be inviting and inclusive, to ask more questions and to be curious. And again, we cannot underscore how important mentorship and sponsorship is. And while we talk a lot about mentorship and sponsorship being really critical for women and people who are underrepresented, we also know that people who may be in majority or dominant groups could also benefit from mentorship and sponsorship, particularly mentorship and sponsorship around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. So this is more of a picture. We saw this from the health policy statement, and we thought it was really interesting. It looks at the spectrum and the continuum of civil to uncivil behaviors. You always want to catch something really early on. So if something's disrespectful, catch it before it moves on to microaggressions, discrimination, and the more evil aspects, bullying, harassment, and even violence. I'll pass it on to you, Dr. Childs.
All right, next slide, please. Let's go to the final slide. Now, I love this picture. This is a picture at UT Southwestern in Dallas, and images are very powerful. They decided, first of all, being in medicine, you go to a lot of organizations where you may walk the halls and see images that doesn't really look like you, or may not have the diversity that you would like to see over time. But UT Southwestern decided to actually put photos on the wall of a diverse population of women and minorities that have been successful at that institution and made a significant impact. So if you have an opportunity to showcase your diverse population and to appreciate their accomplishments, I think it's a very powerful thing to do to change the culture. Next slide, please. This is one of the most famous quotes about you must be the change you wish to see in the world. So we appreciate your time, and I guess we will open for any type of questions and comments from the group.
We did have one question in the chat from the audience. Do you think there should be another term besides ally?
Another term?
Yes, the question was another word for ally.
Oh, yeah. Well, Dr. Parekh, you probably can answer that, but I think there are plenty terms to help us support, sponsor, upstander, look at different opportunities to make a difference with the culture. Ally is just one term that we look at as far as hopefully someone actively participating and making a difference. So yeah, obviously. Are there any
I would-
recommendation?
Yeah, that was going to be my question. I would love to hear what other terms people have in mind and why. So I don't know if somebody feels comfortable unmuting and mentioning what term, but certainly, I think the key would be making something actionable. I think that's the key piece. And being supportive and certainly people are diverse. And so all these strategies will work. They may not work for the same person, but certainly I think they get to the end environment that we want, which is one of inclusion.
Any other questions or comments?
Hi, this is Rachel Maria. I just wanted to say my word that I like is diversity defender. And I think of that because you're essentially defending either yourself or someone else and I hate to say this word, but in a fight, it feels like a constant struggle, but hopefully one day it won't feel like such a struggle and such a fight and have this antagonist, protagonist connotation to it. But the defender of diversity is where I sort of live and in that land and in that headspace. And whether that means you're constantly being on the lookout for an offense, I think is also helpful to me because I'm constantly scanning and making sure that my team, and this has come up very frequently in the past 2 weeks, there's been overt and covert episodes of bias and discrimination and hostile behavior, just continuously scanning the landscape for, quote unquote enemies and just trying to draw them either to your side with education and remediation, or if that's the case, then I just have to defend my team and, call in some reinforcements in that way. So that's how I think about it. It may be a little, sort of like wartime way of thinking about things, but I come from a military family and people in police and so it's just, that's a way of thinking for me. It's a natural way of thinking of things, but I'm open to hearing other suggestions, but that's the term that I always keep top of mind.
Thank you.
I love that term.
I love it. Love it.
Thank you. This is Camille, and I actually posed a question. I appreciate it, and I love that term too. And I guess the question stemmed from, I had a colleague that I referred to as an ally, and he was actually offended by the reference as an ally. He has been somebody who's, like your term, diversity defender of underrepresented minority groups for years. I would say at least from 2000, I have known him since. And I felt so badly that I offended him by referring to him as an ally because I thought I was doing a good thing. And he believes he's more than an ally. So that's why I was looking for, terminology that would better describe those individuals who have supported those of us who are in underrepresented minority groups for years and years and have been upstanders, which thank you for sharing that. That is a new term for me. So just, really getting the vernacular out there, I think is important. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, next time, tell him he's a defender of diversity. Dr. Parekh, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say how much I really like that term. And I so appreciate you explaining why an ally doesn't seem like it fully described how much he was doing. So yeah. I think, Dr. Childs, you and I have talked about this as well. Yeah. We put in the slide about the actionable ally because some people think that's an oxymoron. I mean, not actually,
Right.
that it's repetitive, but actually, I also had wondered whether or not people realize that allies they can be viewed as people who are really doing a lot. And some people don't think it's as much. So putting actionable ally in was a way of showing how proactive allies could be. But it's certainly something we've heard before. So I so appreciate you bringing it up and also offering another great term.
Great. Thank you, guys. Any additional questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Parekh and Dr. Childs. We're so happy to have you today. Really appreciate all the time and effort you took into making those slides and making it interactive. And we recorded the presentation and we'll be posting it later. So thank you so much for really sharing your experience today. It was really a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Okay.